Hello and welcome here today. I would like to thank everybody for joining us. And I'm here and thank Enterprise Greece and everybody for organizing this event today. It is important to address the issue of trade protectionism and its impact on the supply chains in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And most certainly, it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Ms. We have a very good cooperation together, and it will be great that she will share her thoughts with us and her insights today. The major issue we discuss is, of course, the strategic autonomy of our economies. And this is quite a heated debate. But this debate has to be meaningful and credible, and it should be based on evidence. So we do need to take a look at the interdependencies and the complexities of our supply chains, and to identify different options that we should examine and have a balanced policy mix. But of course, we have to always keep in mind that protectionism is always part of the problem. It's not the solution. So the question is how to protect and strengthen our supply chains, but without impeding the free exchange of goods and services. I believe that our goal should be to propel economies towards sustainable growth and increase the resilience. The sustainability aspect should also be a key element of our trade policies. As Greece, of course, we support the concept of strategic autonomy, and as a strategy that will promote the free market, it will maintain the security of our supply chains and also develop alternative solutions, especially for products of critical importance. The European Commission is moving fast. There has been even the rescue mechanism of to build a strategic stock for medical equipment and like protective masks, respirators, and so on. And this will assist all the EU member states. And Greece will also contribute by hosting a strategic reserve of this equipment. The European Commission at the same time has embarked on a review of EU's trade policy, considering also the impact of the COVID crisis. And the objectives are twofold. The first is to assess how trade policy can contribute to a swift and sustainable recovery. And secondly, how to apply the model of the open strategic autonomy that can strengthen in EU and concerns. And this is also something we do with Mrs. Simakopoulou together, because as you know, in the recent trade Eurobarometer, also Greece did not score that well. And in overall, it shows that as a European Union, we need to strengthen the understanding of businesses on the benefits that free trade agreements and overall what the EU, which has the European Commission, it has the absolute mandate for trade policy, what it can do to help business and how our business can be helped. So in Enterprise Greece, we believe that exports will be and trading across borders will be a key driver of growth for Greece, as it is for all other member states. And this can be in the quality agro activities, markets, since we have to go digital. And that's why we also partner with digital platforms like eBay to enable and facilitate the link between the local ecosystem and potential buyers and investors. At the same time, we want to launch programs and further digital campaigns to strengthen Greece as an innovation and product and service brand. And of course, provide targeted information to key markets combined with capacity building and training that we do have to invest on. So today, we hope to foster some productive dialogue on the resilience of trade promotion organization, finding ways to boost confidence in trade and global markets, and the ability of countries to moderate the shock in post-COVID era, although we still have to go through International Trade Center, the World Bank Group, the European Commission, DG Grow and DG Trade, Business Europe and WTO will share with us today their expertise and views. The panels will be moderated by George Filiopoulos, the CEO of Enterprise Greece, and Betty Alexandropoulou, Executive Director and member of the board of Enterprise Greece, both extremely good and valuable colleagues. And once again, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today and invite Mrs. Semakopoulou to have the floor. And Anna-Michelle, please, you suggest us with your kind words and remarks. Thank you very much.
China, which engaged trade practices with its state-owned enterprises and massive subsidies to strategic sectors such as steel and aluminum. Now, when we talk about strategic and open strategic autonomy, we focus on defending Europe's industrial leadership. And if we want to achieve the green and digital transitions, the European Union will need a solid industrial base and resilient and sustainable supply chains. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that the European Union is reliant on third countries for raw materials, and it's also expedited our digital transition. For example, China provides 98% respectively of the EU's supply for and magnesium, key to climate neutrality and the EU has the strategic autonomy and raw material, with the necessary which are third. The European Union is taking its action plan on critical raw material, EU industrial strategy that reinforces our autonomy. Nevertheless, strategic autonomy obviously goes far beyond raw materials sourcing and is required throughout value chains from upstream to downstream. And international competitiveness has made it's now in a position up to $1 billion data cent US dollars to build in Greece. Part of open strategic autonomy. In fact, autonomy, as I like to highlight in international fora, is a Greek word, autonomia, which comes from the word aftos, meaning self, and the word nomos, meaning law. So it literally means being free to make your own rules. In fact, it's not just being free to do so, it's your right to make your own rules. These rules in Europe are based on our commonly shared values. That means democracy, the rule of law, and respect of human rights. Now, more than ever, it's clear that we have to be particularly vigilant in order to safeguard these rules and values. Autonomy becomes a strength when built upon the resilience and diversification of our strategic value chains and on our global network of trade partners. Without autonomy, we're at risk of becoming a playground for systemic rivals in a world dominated by geoeconomics and power politics. And we have no time to waste in pursuing these vital objectives. In conclusion, trade has been at the heart of the Euro. This is an opportunity to unite once again, this time around the goal of open strategic autonomy. To use Jacques Delors' words once again, in the midst of an ever-changing world order, uncertainty and insecurity take over, but it would be a grave error to sacrifice development, and in this case, trade development, for a temporary sense of stability. Open strategic autonomy, which builds on our strengths, is the European Union's response to this global uncertainty. It's our collective way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Asimakopoulou, for honoring us with your presence online today and very interesting insight. It gives me the opportunity to say that in this webinar, we're examining the role of international trade and trade policy in the post-pandemic recovery of our economies. Unfortunately, that recovery will come amid a climate of increasing trade protectionism. The economic shock from the pandemic has highlighted the importance of international trade and particularly the role of SMEs for the global economy. Dr. Hake, Economics and Business. Last but not least, Christine Schreiber, Director in charge of the COSME program, as well as SME, Startup, and Scale-up Policy and Entrepreneurship in DG GROW of the European Commission. She is also the chair of the EASME Steering Committee and board member of the European Investment Fund, with a long career in different posts in the European Commission. I would like to request from each of our panelists a brief 5-minute introductory comment that will set the tone for the discussion and the Q&A part that will follow. So, observing the alphabetical order, I would like to ask Mr. Agarwal to start. Mr. Agarwal.
Trade in services, which is evident from travel restrictions and obviously closing down of the entire hospitality sector. And also, there has been the global FDI flows has shown a decline by 40%, according to the UNCTAD reports. Slide, please. Come now to the main finding of the International Trade Center's quick perception-based survey of businesses around the world. The micro enterprises have been hit by COVID-19. Reported being strongly affected compared to only 43% in the least developed countries. I think this discrepancy can be explained because the companies in least developed countries are not participating much in the global value chains. Now in Europe, the figure along with other developed countries is around 53% companies reported severely affected by the COVID. The next on the WTO report to the G20 trade ministers. The next one now. The 93 trade measures were introduced by the G20 since the crisis broke. The equipment and the medical devices and certain food items to maintain food security in the beginning. Quite a lot of them have already been removed. 70%, the green shaded area in this diagram, of these measures are liberalizing to ensure supplies at home. The next slide is we need to notice the important points which have come during the COVID-19 crisis, and they may have lasting consequences on the global value chains. Now, which are those shifts? One, the shift from global to regional and sub-regional value chains. Second, it's a less global efficiency-seeking FDI. And it is a more regional and sub-regional FDI. And there is shift in some industries from large-scale investment to smaller-scale distributed manufacturing. Next slide. Just to end, I want to give you a feel of the steps that governments have taken, to mitigate some of these difficulties being faced by businesses. They are of financial and non-financial support to limit losses of the businesses, liquidity support, and in non-financial category comes supporting demand, easing regulatory burden, and technical support, awareness raising, etc. I think I will just try to highlight that in the very end, that the support, the next slide please, it's quite a telling slide, and I end by, if you see, are the high GDP countries, their stimulus packages in GDP was also high. You can see the Germany at the top, followed by Italy, France, Japan, United Kingdom on the right-hand side of the diagram, whereas the developing countries, Iran, India, Thailand, Brazil, they are on the left side. So this discrepancy is going to affect or will affect the recovery post-COVID. I stop at this place and will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Agarwal. And now, Dr. Hake, would you like to proceed with your introductory comments?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me and see me? I hope the connection is good. So I'll try not to repeat what was already said. I'll just try to stress several aspects later on. So basically, I just want to recall that there was time before COVID, because we're talking so much about COVID, but there was time and developments before that. And my first slide, can you please move on to the next slide? So my first slide is showing that how the world looked like before COVID. And what we often forget is that we had already a decrease in trade in 2019. So basically what COVID is doing and the COVID-related crisis is doing, or induced crisis is doing, is to very much strengthen and basically these trends that were already visible in 2019. So we had a decline, a very small decline, but a decline in 2019 in trade. So what you can see in merchandise trade, what you can see on the left-hand side of the chart. And it was in line with the decrease of global demand, but also and GDP growth, but also related to trade disputes, as we know, starting between US and China. I just want to stress that lots of trade in the last years in Europe and beyond happened due to to countries and economies being integrated in global value chains. And what is important to stress for Europe and also for Europe and Central Asia is that they are very much intra and regionally integrated. And this is what you can see in the bottom chart, which shows the global value chains in 2000 and 2017, which, I mean, there are many details, but what it shows basically is the emerging role or the strong role of Germany for Europe, for all intermediate and final products, and also the emerging role of China for many countries in Europe. So basically, this is one of the issues, or these are the issues I want to stress. So, number one, we had already a decline of trade. And number two, we have countries being more and more integrated in global value chains. Next slide, please. I'll take with the next slide a bit of detour and show you how COVID came and how it impacted firms in Europe. So we have a survey performed in April to June this year in several EU countries, and European countries as well, not only EU, including Greece. So basically, I want to put a bit Greek firms in the spotlight here. It shows how the impact on demand for firms. Then it shows whether so we basically see that that firms across Europe had demand and supply shortages, and the demand shortages were actually the initial demand shortages were stronger. What we see in the third chart on the upper part, right part, is that firms in the food industry, because we are going to talk about food shortages and prices, they were very much impacted in countries like Moldova, Russia, Albania, so basically emerging European countries, but not that much in Greece and Cyprus and Italy. So it's a kind of an interesting differentiation here. We have also as an impact firms closing, and this was particularly strong in emerging Europe, not that much in Greece, and not that much in Greece. In Italy, a bit stronger. As a final point on this slide is the resilience of firms that was already mentioned. And what we see is that in many countries across Europe, firms tried to switch to online business activities. And this was particularly successful for medium-sized firms, especially in Russia. Greece was not that successful according to our survey, and probably, it was mentioned the digitalization agenda, which is on the EU book. So it's something that we want to give as a kind of a preliminary result. Next slide, please. So when COVID came, I'm not going to repeat the two charts on the upper side, which already were mentioned, but we had a slump in both in imports and exports. And the WTO predicted initially a very large decrease of trade. It revised it very recently at the beginning of October to have a decrease of global trade by 9.2%. The reason being that the decline in some countries and regions weren't that strong as initially projected. But we have to keep in mind that this time is only to this crisis is only to limit years ago in the global financial crisis, and there are several issues here. So the first thing is the first issue to be noted is that the point of impact of the 2008-2009 crisis were US and UK. So basically, it was a rather localized starting point. The second point is that we have we had 12 years ago in the global financial crisis, pretty much demand driven crisis. And now we have a very much serious supply disruptions that affects sectors across the board and around the world. And the protectionism or protectionist measures are not new, and I'll show you on the next slide a chart. But what we see as a emerging tendency here in the recent months is that there is a way of focusing more on not on imports or import tariffs, but on exports. So export restrictions being bans, being quotas, or being even implied export restrictions. Just to remind, because I think sometimes when using a word, it's and a term, it's a bit we forget what is actually protectionism. So protectionism is a gamut of ways in which government action discriminate against foreign commercial interests. So basically, this is the part of protect and that relates to protectionism. Next slide, please. So what you can see on this chart is that we have increasingly export-related measures. And this is, per definition, from an economic point of view, this is a problem, because this is so basically a government action or government's actions that do not really refer a market failure. So basically an export restriction or export ban the way it is performed now cannot refer a market failure that is already on the market. So this is when only protectionist measures are implemented without a supplementary industrial policy, for instance, there is definite damage for the consumers in the long run in a country. It should be not to forget, and I'll just stop here, not to forget that protectionist measures are very much neutralizing the positive effects that trade has on poverty. And this is something that is very worrying, and it's also very worrying for countries that are traditionally not hit that much by poverty, or saw a very steady increase of or decline of poverty rates in the past decades, including countries in Europe. So we have countries in Europe where poverty is supposed to or is projected to increase to more than 15% of total population. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you very much to Enterprise Greece and to Chairman Mr. Dimitriadis for having invited me to give you the perspective of the European Commission, and more precisely from an SME policy angle, because this is really my area of responsibility. And let me recall in introduction the strong and well-known EU commitment in favor of fair and open trade. Protectionism is clearly a no-way street. Our commitment to fair and open trade is firstly demonstrated through the completion, of course, of the European single market. It can always be improved, but this is a 550 million customers market where almost all trade barriers have been removed. And we had, of course, to be very vigilant during the COVID-19 pandemic to keep the single market functioning properly. And we have all suffered from the disruptions which emerged when member states were reacting tremendously now. When it comes to international trade outside the single market, we are doing our utmost to facilitate the internationalization of European companies, and especially SMEs. We are developing dedicated SME chapters in our new free trade agreements to maximize benefits for EU businesses. And we are also working hand in hand with trade promotion organizations who are often active in the Enterprise Europe network, the EU-funded business support network, to help SMEs innovate and grow internationally. Moreover, we have also set up a forum with trade promotion organizations like Enterprise Greece and many others to communicate more regularly with them and exchange best practices. So how did we react to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has particularly affected SMEs? SMEs do have fewer liquidity reserves than large companies. And many of the sectors hardest hit, such as tourism and hospitality, are of course made up 99.9% of SMEs. And so as part of its emergency response, the Commission has deployed a number of measures to remedy the most pressing liquidity problems faced by companies. But at the moment, we are trying to move from the emergency liquidity support provided to companies in the first months of the pandemic, which was absolutely essential, to a more sort of medium to long-term recovery plan for the European economy. And SMEs will be able to benefit greatly from all the different pillars of the future 750 billion recovery plan with its recovery and resilience facility. There are no specific dedicated resources exclusively earmarked for SMEs, but there is a strong recommendation to member states to actually focus on SMEs when they draw up their national plans. So let me also stress that many of the key elements for delivering the European recovery are already clearly present in the SME strategy for this twin transition to digitization and sustainability. The second pillar is reducing the regulatory burden and improving market access to the single market and of course beyond, and improving access to finance. And what I would like to stress as well, that it covers all types of Europe's 25 million SMEs and their 100 million employees, from innovative startups to the traditional bakery around the corner. And the strategy really tries to develop a comprehensive approach based on horizontal measures, helping all kinds of SMEs, as well as, of course, targeted actions which cater for specific needs. And we really think that the strategy is a key tool for helping SMEs to recover from the crisis and increase their resilience. Because if anything, I would say, has been adapted, had to be changed after the crisis broke out, is that we have, in a way, a third pillar. We have the digital challenge, the sustainability challenge, and the resilience challenge. Because clearly resilience economies and resilience, I think, in terms of resilient international supply chains. And this is, I think, where the discussions you're having today are particularly relevant. So thank you very much, and looking forward to a very good debate.
Thank you so much, Ms. Schreiber. Many interesting points made by our panelists, and I think that we will have a very fruitful discussion. Let's start with some questions for our panelists. I will start again by alphabetical order, and I'll go to Mr. Agarwal. Mr. Agarwal, the recent survey on SMEs by International Trade Center highlights the deep impact of the pandemic on European companies and companies in other continents as well. Now, considering the close partnership of ITC with business support organizations and TPOs, how do you envision a coordinated approach to support businesses, and especially SMEs, in the post-pandemic period in order to best secure inclusive trade and sustainable economic recovery?
Thank you. I think from the discussion, it has become quite clear, and also, I was quite pleased to hear, the three-pronged strategy of the European Union also, which in a way gels quite well with we as an organization thinking after our survey and having interaction with SMEs. Mainly our work is in the developing countries, that what kind of support can be provided to them through intermediaries. I will categorize that into three. One is the advocacy with policymakers on accelerated digitization and simplified procedures. I think these are the points which were covered by a distinguished speaker from the European Commission as well. It is quite important in developing countries, but I was pleased to hear it's important even in Europe. In developing countries, we have seen overnight change in the mindset of government officials towards reforms in this direction, which is a healthy sign. The second is that I also presented that there needs to be an alignment of government policies with changing business realities of investments. Now, this is quite an important change, I would say. And any alignment of the government policies with these business realities, changing business realities, will help in supporting industrial and investment linkages. The second category, I would say, is to act as intermediaries between small business, and highlight this by making 2 points. Which SMEs may not have been au fait in using. I think this point also came up. Second, I would say at a more granular level, what I've seen is that relationship between players in a supply chain is governed by contractual agreements. And because of the liquidity problem among small firms in particular during this period, these contracts required changes in, for example, payment terms, etc., and to maintain the continuity of the supply chains. And this obviously is helped if the intermediaries also play a role. And the last, I would say, category is definitely enhanced access to information and capacity building. Now, there are changing demands of supply patterns, and you need to inform your own businesses about it. Then there are changing product standards and other quality requirements, including SPS requirements in some cases. Then more emphasis on worker safety systems, etc. And ISO has standards. So therefore, equipping your SMEs to follow those standards, which were not so considered important earlier on, is an extremely important part of the capacity building and sharing of information, which the TPOs or any intermediary can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Agarwal. And now turning to Dr. Hake. Dr. Hake, do you believe that are more likely to follow the scenario that predicts a 5.2 decrease or the scenario that predicts a 13.8 decrease?
So this, yes, thank you for this question. So this is basically this question is related to research that we did in the World Bank. And it's important to recall to what extent these percentages are related to world growth and world trade growth. So basically, this upward or downward scenario are related to the performance of China in terms of food supply in the first quarter of this year. So this would mean that in an upward scenario, upward in a negative meaning, which means that in an upward scenario, the world trade and world food trade develops even worse than China's world trade, food trade did. So this is one of the issues I wanted to stress. So what we see is we have an increase in food prices, and we have, according to products and in different sectors, we have already shortages. We have very many developing countries which are net food importers. So basically, an increase of export restrictions in major countries which are net food exporters would very much damage part of the world trade, which is related to developing countries. So these percentages are very much restricted on the assumption that the effects of the COVID crisis will be contained in the next 1 to 2 quarters after the first quarter, and we passed already this time, which means that as compared to the global financial crisis and there the increase of food shortages or shortages of food supply would mean that we are more in a negative scenario already. As related to food prices, we have several countries contributing to as which imposed supply of medical. So which are the countries which would be most affected if these three trade blocks limit supply? So basically, we have many countries. Not a realistic assumption to think that countries to in one industrial chain in one production place. So basically, this is what we are calling for, that not to restrict this trade and not to increase tariffs and not to impose tariffs in these times. I want to make a remark to one of the previous speakers on the government interventions in this area. It's true that developed countries, and especially developed countries, have invested very much or are putting huge stimulus packages in order to support the economy. This is true, but what we have to look into is what is the structure of these packages, support packages, and in many countries, including some developed countries, but this is especially true for developing countries, we have lots of
towards a more resilient schemes and examples?
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, I mean, as I said beforehand, one of the pillars of the SME strategy is the transition to more sustainable business models. And what we have done is to create specific sustainability advisors in the context of our Enterprise Europe network, who can actually give very dedicated advice to SMEs. In the different natures, some are already quite advanced and maybe potential technological leaders in sustainability. Others are really starting from scratch. So we really have set up this network of sustainability advisors to help and guide them. Then, of course, one needs to recall what I referred to beforehand, that we have the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And if I just look at Greece, I mean, the national allocation for Greece under this facility is likely to be 17.9 billion. So it's a huge amount of money. In addition, we also have the 1.3 billion under the Just Transition Fund. And here, there are specific percentages which are earmarked to go into green and to go into digital. So it's really, I think, very, very important that member states pick up this tremendous opportunity to come actually forward with the national recovery plans, where they are, I mean, as I said before, SMEs are targets. There's no specific SME target, but it's obvious and strongly under the which went out because they were paid late by a supplier. And very often, and I mean, Greece is no different in this respect, and actually it's quite a big issue in Greece. It's actually the public sector which pays late the SMEs, starting a vicious circle of SMEs going bankrupt. Then obviously if they're bankrupt, you have less tax income. So I think this is really also a very important opportunity when we talk about resilience, also at national level, to make sure that payment terms are met from the public sector, and that of course you don't have any unfair trading practices from larger companies squeezing out smaller companies in terms of payment delays.
Thank you, Ms. Schreiber, for the elaborate answer. And now I'd like to urge the audience for comments through the chat room. We will address them directly to our panelists, but at the same time, the panelists themselves can take the floor again to provide further insight and comment on each other's presentation. In the meantime, I've got some questions beforehand that some of our participants submitted to us. And I would like to ask to start by CEO of Intralot Australia, who states three questions. The first is, the pandemic has surfaced, among others, the need of going digital and working from home. Is there a proposed plan for coping with these new trends? Let me mention all three questions, and then you may start responding. The second one is, some of the industries have been highly affected, and he lists as examples the tourism industry, aviation, hospitality, and so on. And he asks if there are for products to China and other Southeast Asian
I'm not an answer the that specific or the job area you can sustain by purely digital presence without presence can work or not depends on the nature of the work that in, for example, our kind of work, which is a technical assistance it's organization, what we have found combination of the online as well as physical, which will to follow. We have learned a lot that we could perhaps reduce quite a lot of physical contact, but not entirely. There are certain aspects of the work which, to be effective, have to be physical. I'll stop at that.
All right, anyone else?
If I could add some.
Sure, Mrs. Makopoulou.
Yeah, I think that it was sort of touched upon. I mean, this is a broad range of issues, but I can tell you that COVID has not changed the basic priorities of this term, this commission, which are the twin green and digital transition. And I think as Ms. Schreiber said before, a lot of these funds that are going to the recovery through the recovery package are clearly earmarked for these two priorities. So in respect to the questions that are asked, yes, of course, there's an enormous amount of discussion going on in the Parliament as to how we need to address these new methods of work that are more and more remote and what this means at various levels, including the rights of those who are working remote, and also to protect people who, as Mr. Agarwal said, can't work remotely. There's an enormous amount of discussion going on with respect to how to help industries that have been hit very hard by the pandemic, or a number of other industries. So I would just like to highlight that these are, the questions have touched a complex set of issues, but clearly these are the major issues that we're now trying to deal with. And I think that in this open strategic autonomy and the resilience concept are a common thread throughout all the policies that are now being reviewed, whether that's trade policy, whether it's competition policy, whether it's industrial policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. And to you, it's more, I may say, Mr. Project FDI attract invest in Italy real estate. Canico says the EU should have a strong in supporting internationalization. Time it should engage with the nations to develop programs in coordination, additionality of the EU efforts. And I do believe that Mr. Macanico would like to emphasize the need for better coordination of both chambers of commerce and TPOs.
I just like to say that I share Mr. Macanico's concern, of course. I think the dissemination of information and the engagement of SMEs through TPOs is a very approach to greater SME involvement in it, as Christine also pointed out in the Commission's action plan for SMEs. This is also foreseen there, and I think that today's event and the engagement that we've had, for example, through my close cooperation with Mr. Dimitriadis and also Minister Fragogiannis as part of the INTA committee, in trying to, for example, in the Hellenic Parliament, organize to the review of the trade policy. And also, I know you have undertaken as Enterprise Greece and will be undertaking with respect to the market access portal, which is going to be released, I think will go a long way in harmonizing in accordance with a suggestion made by the gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you. This is encouraging news. And now I'm going to move to the next question by Mr. Van Stertegem. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing the name correctly. He's the Director for Trade, Government of Flanders, Flanders Investment and Trade Agency. And his question is, does the panel agree reliance on international markets is a disadvantage for a country when looking at the recovery capacity in the post-COVID era? Who would like to answer? Or
I'll just probably jump in here. Well, I wouldn't agree with this. What we do see as an emerging trend is localization or a more regional development of trade and global value chains. So basically, what this crisis might induce in the end is that we have refocusing of production and global value chains in a nearby countries as compared to China, etc. So this is the so-called nearshoring, which could take place. But I wouldn't agree with these statements. And this for the EU, this for some countries aspiring members of the EU.
all right, would any of our panelists like to add something to this, or proceed with the next question?
I'm happy to briefly come in, and I think it's also, linked to the suggestion on the better, cooperation with trade promotion organizations, and I think. The important issue is that everybody does their share, that we link up networks very well. And as I mentioned, the Enterprise Europe Network, I think, is doing a great job in making sure that there are these interlinkages. And so it's a very welcome reminder, but I think we have actually come a very long way, and we have excellent now cooperation and making sure that we have huge complementarities and no sort of overlap of tasks. In terms of excessive dependency, I think the whole concept of also, resilience, and this links up a bit what you just said, Maria Haki, is not about going local exclusively and basically, going away from trade, but it's basically to also look always at alternatives. Because what we've seen in the disruption of supply chains is if you have exclusive supply chains, which, with a focus on one exclusive country or an entire dependency, then of course you get into trouble. So the issue is rather to actually also be able to react quickly. And that's why, for instance, we with the help not only of the Enterprise Europe Network, with Chamber of Commerce, with our SME envoys, we had a rapid alert system. Then when there were disruptions in the supply chain, that there was quick reaction, first of identification of the disruption, but then also of identifying alternative suppliers. And this has actually worked very well in crisis. And so I understand that the question is, of course, highly international. I think it may be an issue in short term, and in some supply chains may be adjusted. But I do not think, I think in the long run, it will remain an advantage to be sort of fully open and integrated in international markets, because it also allows you to bounce back when growth picks up in some parts of the world more faster.
Thanks, Schreiber. And now I'm going to hear a statement by Dimitri Petrov, who is the Office for Economic Affairs in Chicago. And his comment is related to the US, and that before the onslaught of the conferences took place, the discomfort of America with further ahead of the political comment by our panelists, U.S. tendencies and towards free trade and protectionism.
If I may.
Sure.
Yes. Sure. Okay. Well, obviously, we're at a very critical, let's say, moment for U.S. policy in the sense that there's elections coming up. If you ask me, I don't think that the United States is going to change drastically elected in the presidential elections, but clearly, let's say, during the Trump administration, to put it mildly, trade tensions have increased rather than decreased. Recently, there was in the direction of tensions with it was supposed to, I'll call it a micro, referred to in my speech over the reduction of tariffs for enter the European Union and in exchange certain goods to enter the United States. Let's say that was supposed to halt the trade tensions, at least for a certain period of time. At the same time, as you all know, we have United States position to block the appellate body, which has brought the entire WTO to a standstill and resulted in there being parallel alternative dispute resolution mechanisms on a plurilateral as opposed to a multilateral basis. And at the same time, we also have the Boeing Airbus case, which has now come to, let's say, a full is going to be on both sides. So, at all that, I openly from a great fan of the potential for the commonality of values that we share with the United States and Europe as opposed to potential trading partners. I think that going forward, there are great opportunities and that this can be part of this open strategic autonomy that Europe would like to cultivate. I think that that trade with the United States and the transatlantic relationship can and should be a very large part of our attempt at resilience and autonomy.
Thank you, Mrs. Markopoulou. And here I would like to ask our panelists if they would like to make some final comments, because we are reaching our time limits. Mr. Agarwal?
No, well, I can just make one point while agreeing with my other co-panelists about the need to maintain international trade. It is only a shift. I would say that, maybe the adjustment will be that the goods will move from one remote corner of the world to the another remote corner of the world. And also, we'll have to take into account the scale at which they operate, and they feel that it is efficient, because if it is going to be more and more limited to the regional and serving the regional and the sub-regional market and not the global market, those kind of business imperatives will come into play in even determining the competitiveness of the businesses in the adjustments that will become definitely mandatory after the post-COVID crisis. Thank you.
Dr. Hake?
my final remark as a representative of the World Bank Group is that we do our best to support liquidity shortages and immediate needs for firms, especially in the international finance cooperation in developing markets. And this has been extensively used until. However, although the in front of are not probably that much different of them, or how important they are utilization. So we basically saw also as a of the survey, the countries are very much resilient and trying to shift to adjust their businesses and processes, business procedures and processes, but they still need our help for this. Thank you.
Ms. Schreiber?
Yes, I mean, I think Anne-Michelle Asmekoupoulou already, made a very strong plea. I couldn't agree with more on the need for open trade and this open strategic autonomy. I think we really have to look at this resilient. I think we're not going to just put a reset button and we're going to go back to where we were before. Development, I think, as far as concerned with where the realization that you will never actually, in most cases, start in one company and work there to the end of your life, that basically it's a totally different set. People will change companies. They will also change probably even types of jobs, because there is a need to be adaptive and resilient at the individual level. And I think now we've come in a way to crisis now, but we may have another crisis coming up of a completely different nature we're not even thinking about now. And I think it's a moment now to actually equip all the companies to have this resilience and to react to unforeseen shocks. I think this is in a way the lesson forward in the context of course, open economies and very strong commitment to international trade, which does not exclude a focus also on local sourcing, especially I think in the food sector, etc. We've seen a strong development also in the context of sustainability, of bigger emphasis, of course, on local short change, this short supply movement. So that would be the trends I would see.
Thank you, Ms. Schreiber. And Ms. Asmekoupoulou, your final remarks regarding the topics we discussed in this panel?
I think we've much for the invitation and the participate in this high level, so many co-participants, and to in the Hellenic Republic, that I, as vice chair of and as a member of the, am very happy at your side, and at your service, the important task you have ahead of you.
Thank you so much. This is very encouraging. Great discussion, very insightful. We covered many interesting topics with great insights. Thank you again. And I think it's time that, so we are going to move to the next panel that Ms. Alexandropoulou. Thank you again, and we are going to continue with the next panel.
Thank you, Mr. Philiopoulos, previous panel, for a very vivid discussion. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our second panel discussion. In the recent Digital Economic Forum organized by ECOFIN, it was reported that due to the lockdown, European businesses will lose at least 720 billion this year alone. It was also mentioned that up to 260,000 European companies employing as many as 35 million people face significant financial troubles because of the coronavirus crisis. Just in the 5 biggest European economies, 45 million people have had their wages partially covered by the state in an effort to retain their jobs. The Next Generation EU Recovery Package stands at 1.8 trillion euros. It focuses on making member states' economies more resilient with an emphasis on green economy and digital economy jobs. In this panel, we will look more closely at what has been observed so far and what that may mean for recovery. In this respect, we highly appreciate the participation of the next 3 distinguished panelists. Thank you for being here. As we did with the first panel, I would like to remark, just move on with some. So I will start with relations, as well as those of the EU and neighboring countries, WTO issues, export controls, and sanction regimes, as well as market access policies, including international investment and raw material policies, and as well as international public procurement. So, Ms. Bournou, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure for me to participate in this event today. I think that it is quite important to bring together this expertise to discuss about the recovery, the role of trade and other policies, especially in the post-COVID context. Perhaps I would start by explaining what Business Europe is for those of you who may not be familiar with our organization. We are the umbrella association for employer and industrial federations in Europe. And actually, our members go beyond the EU 27 member states, also including associations coming from the EFTA countries and also the accession countries to the EU. As we are currently working on our response to the Commission's public consultation on the review of trade policy, perhaps in terms of introduction, I can share with you where we stand on this particular issue, because of course the context is so for us of previous use and trade and investment policies remain open. For us, this means an ambitious agenda that promotes free and fair trade that is based on rules. At the same time, of course, the pandemic has further, if you like, accentuated an increasingly difficult environment in the area of global trade. And therefore, we also believe that the EU's trade policy should also become more assertive. We need to look at our relations, for example, with our key trading partners and recalibrate and rebalance them wherever it is necessary. And here, for example, China and the US could be examples that were also mentioned in the discussion before. Of course, in this regard, we also need to work towards leveling the playing field and promoting EU standards. And FTAs are actually quite critical in this regard, but perhaps we can get back to this point a little later in the discussion. It was also mentioned before that the future trade policy of the EU will be shaped around this concept of open strategic autonomy, which is very much connected to the resilience of supply chains. Now, there are, of course, some voices that call for the reshoring of production in Europe. Our view is that even this takes place in some areas, it cannot be a result of state intervention. It should rather be the result of market-based decisions of companies and in full compliance with WTO rules. What we should do instead is actually ensuring that we have the right framework conditions in Europe to allow companies to stay in Europe, thrive, and grow. We therefore to build resilience in Europe. And of course, trade policy can play a key role in this regard. Finally, I would also like to mention the interplay between trade policy, the Green Deal of the EU, and digital transformation. On our side, we are looking at how we can make these policies, let's say, more complementary and mutually. I'd like to stop here as an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bournou, very interesting. We'll move on to Antonia Diacandoni from the Trade Policies Review Division of WTO, and with long prior experience in the DG ENER of the European Commission. Antonia also has extensive co-authorship of papers on global value chain issues and trade monitoring in the multilateral trade system. So Antonia, the floor is with you.
Hello, everybody. Hello from Geneva, the WTO. We're here to discuss world trade and protectionism, and we cannot assess protectionist tendencies without having transparency. So this will be my first point. Transparency is very important and is a central pillar for the WTO. With transparency and predictability at the core of the multilateral trading system, this is fundamental for policymakers, traders, and investors around the world in their quest to make informed and right decisions. Which findings I will present in a minute, is the only horizontal and regular transparency exercise within the multilateral trading system. So this exercise includes information provided by our 164 members, information presented in the WTO trade monitoring report verified by our members. I was glad to see that the previous panelists have already referred to our reports. So twice a year, we produce a report on the G20 economies and a report on the WTO. Members so are full partners of these exercises. This is a credible platform, 164 members. Trade policy making. They can even talk about and place every and transparent at the very core of this exercise. I will go through the findings. Many of them were already presented before. The first thing, so the latest trade monitoring report was circulated in July 2020. The next one will be published in November 2020 and November. So in July 2020, we have a number like almost 366 trade restrictive and trade facilitating measures put in place by around the world. Is that fully covering the start of the pandemic. So in the early stages of the pandemic, the trade responses to the COVID-19 was mainly by putting in place restrictions, primarily restrictions in the export side. So we had stricter export regulations on personal protective equipment like gloves, masks, drugs and medicines, and also medical equipment like ventilators and other respiratory support equipments. Also, we had specific quotas and new requirements to authorize export of these goods, and sometimes we had export bans. Immediately after, we had also recorded restrictive trade measures targeting food and food products, like sugar, cereals, meslim, rice, vegetables, etc. And that was in the aim to guarantee local food supplies. On the import side, we saw also increased tariffs and taxes, in some cases to petrol and oils primarily, and that was mainly from countries from emergency economic support programs and measures that they had to put. So that was just of the pandemic. 60% that we have recorded, they were now facilitating. Just to give a small examples, mainly that was this new shift was coming from net importers, so they have reduced their tariffs on a variety of goods, such At the same time, this crisis has also underscored the importance of the services measures. So the importance of transport, financial measures, financial services, distribution and logistical services. We saw also we recorded 99 services measures related to the pandemic that they as well were facilitating. In addition to this, we had SPS measures, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, standards and regulations related to the pandemic. In addition to all these trade measures, we saw an unprecedented number of support measures, general economic support measures put in place by governments in every single country to cope. Packages were rescue packages, governments be back again and work properly. So we have recorded 406 measures. In May, it's estimated that the global fiscal support to fight COVID-19 was about 9 trillion. Put it in three different groups. By the crisis. First, to increase the capacity of national healthcare systems, incentive to research diagnoses, many schemes. Financial impacts of the pandemic outbreak, so financial support, household, employed workers and employees. The specific targeted were cleaning and security, but also agriculture, fisheries, childcare, creative, and also sports. Another set of support measures put in place by governments were measures put in place by central banks to ease monetary policies, reduce policy rates, issue and purchase government bonds, and ease debt terms and reschedule deference on credit installments. Also, governments put in place measures to ensure economic stability. With these support measures, what we saw is that high-income economies put in place much more of the number of measures income economies. Poorer economies funding obtained by organizations, regional banks, donors. The last point I would like to make, because we talk about protectionism, as the WTO trade monitoring exercise about trends were not really allowed to in the protectionism in the WTO. So what we have observed since the creation of this exercise in 2009 with the global financial crisis, up to now, we saw very limited evidence that the countries have jumped in a protectionism trend. Trade tensions between our major trading partners, and increased the uncertainty in international trade and investment, and has eroded the confidence that underpins a healthy global economy and a healthy trade system. The arrival of the pandemic has added to this uncertainty. However, for us, WTO, we see no huge protection tendencies right now. This can change, of course, and we think that this is because of the lessons from the past, and also because of the existence of the multilateral rules for international trade. Sometimes some players, they the rules. Thank you.
Ms. Cipollone, thank you for your remarks. Very insightful indeed. Now moving on to our last but not least of the panelists, Thomas Leveillon, Deputy Head of Unit E3 for Industry, Goods, Energy, Customs, and Origin of DG Trade and the European Commission, coordinating the work of the Directorate General for Trade's COVID-19 Task Force and monitoring the actions taken by third countries. Thomas has a long career in the private sector as a manager of environmental projects in Asia, Chief Executive Officer of small and medium-sized enterprises in Spain, as well as a startup. Thank you, Mr. Leveillon. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I will intend to, in my intervention, not to repeat too much some of the elements that have already been covered. So I would just like indeed to recall the impact that the COVID had. The health emergency has indeed, as mentioned by previous speakers, triggered several problems. We have seen the first taking place was export restriction. The first reaction was indeed in order to limit the outflow of potential essential goods in order to make sure that the country was better equipped in order to fight the health emergency. The second one is also once those countries usually have realized that the local production was insufficient in order to meet, then to implement trade facilitation measures, so in order to facilitate the import. So we understand in the approach. And what we see now, which is certainly the more worrying signals, is the budgetary consequences that the COVID has had on all the countries. As indicated by the previous speaker, we have GDP of up to, plans of up to 10 to 20% of GDP usually that have been put in place by the members. Serious impact on the growing tendency now not anymore directly related in order to fight better the COVID, but just because of the consequence of the budgetary imbalance that we see more and more barrier being put in place by partners. So there is no doubt that in this need also to reflect about how trade can happen in a trade tensions were quite high between the major trading operator. And also we had also some tensions on a growing tendency of using trade as a for other objectives, and also at the same time a weakening of the WTO. So all of these, when on top of that also we take into consideration the perception by Europeans of a growing criticism towards the impact on globalization and technological change, there is no doubt that there is the right moment in order to reflect how trade can in a post-COVID world. So that's why there is precisely the trade policies that has been that has been launched with a view to see how can trade contribute to several objectives. So the first one is obviously how trade can contribute better to a swift but that is at the same time also sustainable and socio-economic. Also at the same time to in a autonomy. The main objective there should be seen as the capacity of the EU to reap the benefit of the openness because we should still remind plays mainly outside of the. But at the same time, to ensure for the workers, consumer, and also to protect it from outside. And at the same time, as the High Representative is mentioning it, to be able to seek to work together, but also to be ready to act unilaterally if we must. But the greater real, I would like just to precisely to trigger the debate. The dimension to which those shortages are related to state intervention is still something that is often excessively perceived. And also we should keep in mind that we have a strong interconnection with the different partners. Just for an example, is these ventilators important in order to fight to help fighting the COVID. Philips, which is one of the main European producer, has its main factory in the US, while the main US manufacturer, Medtronic, has EU. So we also have to keep in mind that because of this interlink, it is not necessarily just through reshoring that will be able to increase the resilience, but also certainly by strengthening and making stronger the trade disciplines in order to ensure that the trade flow even during the health emergency. As regards also several colleagues have already been mentioned. I would just like to recall also the pledge of the EU and also the need that the WTO reform is there in order to strengthen the rule-based approach. At the moment where there is so much tendency indeed for calling to protectionism, we see the WTO really as one of the key elements in order to that should be at the heart of the global system. And also, as regard the better resilience and of the new economy, I would just like to mention two essential elements, I guess. It is first the digitalization. Indeed, it is. There is no doubt that the technological development integrated in the business plan of the companies, and there what we need to do is also to make sure that the trade rules are there also to support e-commerce and to favor this type of new development and to adapt the trade rules to the new environment in which the companies will be operating. And last but not least, it is also regarding the greening of the economy. It is something that is the COVID has not stopped the problem related to the environment, and there is no doubt that the future trade rules will have also to take better into consideration this element. And then to conclude, just to remind that there is obviously growing competition in the world market. And we also need to make sure that there is not unfair competition for our companies. And that's why through unilateral action, we are making sure that the EU is well equipped in order to address this problem and to act unilaterally in the event that such an unfair practice will be constated. I would like just to recall, for instance, the enforcement regulation that have been revised in order to be able to act quickly. We are also developing tools in order to deal with effective effect of foreign subsidies. There is a white paper that has been launched recently to reflect on this. And also there is we've been protecting and also at the same time upgrading dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO. Well, that's it for me, and thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to intervene. Bye.
Thank you as well, Mr. Levillon. Very, very interesting as well. And at this point, because I saw some nods and some smiles while each of you were talking, I'd like to start by giving you the opportunity for a first heard from each other and any interventions you insights based on what you've heard from each.
I managed to unmute myself. Thank you very much. Yes, just perhaps our support to the Commission's initiatives in the context of COVID-19 in particular, because of course, as both Thomas and Antonia said, the first tendency, the first reaction of governments in times of crisis tends to be towards protection. Not using necessarily the word protectionism, but towards protection. And we saw that also in the context of the EU single market. And this is important because, of course, when you operate in different measures for bans or market. So we very much reaction from the part of the Commission is these export bans with an authorization regulation, basically making it possible to have better, let's say, vigilance and control over what is happening in this area without banning exports. And that was critically important because, of course, secure supply to personal protective equipment and other critical materials during we cannot overlook the guidance that they published in the area of screening of foreign investments, because it elements around the area of health and healthcare. Also, of course, I need to refer to the Greek initiative, which took but also at our borders, because we had situations where goods were in trucks at the borders and they were not allowed to enter into the EU. I think this is quite important to reiterate that in this kind of situations, having an oversight at European level can always be very, very useful and have a cooperation with what is happening in the context of the EU and the member states' activities as well. I take the point from the WTO that we don't see an overwhelming protectionist tendency, but of course measures remain there. Not all of them have become into trade facilitating measures. And on the part of Business Europe, what we want to emphasize is that the experience and the lessons learned from the crisis of 2008-2009 need to be also taken on board here, because we do not want these measures to become permanent barriers. We want them to be, let's say, proportionate. We want them to be targeted, and we want them to be temporary in nature. And of course, In this context, they also have to be properly notified to the WTO. And I will say once again that we very much welcome database on all the very also for businesses.
Thank you, Ms. Bournou. It's much appreciated. And I see Ms. Silvia Cardoni would like to share something with us as well. So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophia, for the intervention. And you remind me about the launching of the WTO, that we have dedicated page on the trade, world trade and COVID. So this was initiated in the very beginning of the pandemic, where all my colleagues and myself included were working from home. And it was like a crazy period. Well, still continues to be very crazy with all the measures put in place by governments. So the new add-in, because this website includes COVID measures on goods, services, and IP, all right? And as of yesterday late, we added the support measures communicated by our members to us directly, to the WTO trade monitoring exercise. So thank you for reminding this. This is again restrictive measures as we're following the restrictions since the global financial crisis up to now. We've seen these restrictive measures putting in place from everywhere. What we've seen is that they stay in place. So from 2009 up to now, if you look at it, they have been piling up. And our last estimate about how much world imports are covered by restrictions right now is almost 9% of world trade. So yes, yes. I was also very happy to hear from my colleague Thomas Levaillon the call for a strong multilateral system. This is important if we want to fight protectionism and because we live in an interdependent world and we need each other. So we need strong rules and we need to be committed to the system, whatever the system is, because WTO now, many discussions are about the reform, the blockade of the appellate body. So yes, we need a strong system, and this will be very important to fight protectionism and restrictions. Thank you.
That's great. I see support on each other's views. So I'm going to ask Mr. Levaillon if he'd like to also share something with us in terms of the remarks we just heard.
No, yeah, thanks a lot. Obviously, it's difficult not to agree. Operator at the very beginning of the COVID crisis is a lack of transparency regarding the measures that were taken. On top of that, also you had often the administration that were not functioning on an optimal manner. And also you have not necessarily everything that was published in the local press. It was taken very fast. So in this area also, in addition to the work done by the WTO Secretariat, the perceived and identified by the European delegations. So I've contributed also as much as we could in order to provide the support to the industry. Regarding also the situation, it's true that we also are now monitoring those, and we are also keeping an eye on them with a strong intention to get them removed. Obviously, we expect those from our trade partners. But unfortunately, we are still in an health emergency situation. The situation may be less concern from all the authorities that we need to remain vigilant. So we're also in a situation where it is very difficult for the EU to be vocal towards certain countries, because they may have a ground in order to still maintain those measures. Unfortunately, also, we do not see the end of this health crisis for the coming weeks. We hope in the coming months. But it is certainly something that you will hear more and more indeed calling for lifting those as in parallel to the reestablishment of a better health environment. But we should keep also in mind that those barriers that are health related are a small fraction of what will be really distortive. What our concern is much more now the introduction of very pure classical barrier, not aimed at supporting the fight of the those that will be those on which and we do not need to wait the situation to be removed.
And all on to some questions I have for you before we move on to the questions for each. Starting with Ms. Bourneau. According to the recent Business Europe's proposal for a European economic recovery plan, cooperation at institutional level is key for economic recovery. Also, ensuring the implementation of free trade agreements could ensure a resilient, sustainable trade for opening doors to companies, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. So we would like you to listen to your opinion of the importance of FTAs towards this direction.
Thank you very much for this question. I think this exemplifies very, very concretely how trade policy can help in the recovery, because trade policy has different tools at different levels. And of course, we talked a lot about the WTO and the need for reform. Focusing now at the bilateral level, what we see is that we need to use our free trade agreements in a way that ensures that everybody, users of FTAs are and in this regard, we welcome very much the attention of the current Commission and, of course, the future trade policy, the trade strategy that is currently being prepared and discussed, to focus more on the implementation of free trade agreements and the enforcement in general. I have a couple of points as concrete steps, what we need to do to ensure that. Because, of course, there is no reason for us to have trade agreements, and the EU is a champion in this area, if we are not able to use them. What the Commission has found in many reports is that the preference utilization could be further increased. So first of all, we need to start by the content of the agreement. We need to make sure that it includes rules that are clear and simple for everybody to use. Large companies, medium companies, SMEs, and micro companies. And the previous panel also referred to specific SME chapters, which we very much welcome in this regard, because their intention is to improve transparency and help them use the trade agreements. For this to happen, we also need better data, especially in the area of trading services, which is for the moment lacking. So how can we, let's say, improve our knowledge and information about how the existing FTA the role of the member states and the trade promotion authorities and business organizations like ours in Business Europe, but also the chambers of commerce is quite critical, has to do with increasing awareness about FTAs at different levels, at national level, because there the picture is quite mixed. And we have some EU member states that do a lot in this regard, but other member states, perhaps the smaller ones, that need to be further And then, of course, focusing a little bit on Thomas already referred trade, and all these instruments at hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now let me move on to the next question. This is for Ms. Iacardone. The impact of the crisis on global trade and the economy is expected to be very substantial. Basically, I'm asking for your prediction of its impact in the long term.
Thank you for the question. So the economic outlook is exceptionally uncertain, of course. So projections and estimates are subject to unusual high degree of uncertainty. So the world trade slowed sharply in the first half of 2020, but now there are some signs of a rebound from the COVID-19, and the trade growth products was very strong in these last 2 months. We have seen a small recovery. Its latest forecast estimating the drop for 2020 at 9.2% of world merchandise. So this decline is decline observed a decline that is less severe than the one we've indicated in April earlier this year. WTO in April has produced two scenarios, one pessimistic and one optimistic, a drop between 12.9 and 31.9%. So we're in a most positive trend right now. The outcomes for 2020 will be very much depend on how economies will perform in the fall and in early winter. And of course, there will be a substantial heterogeneity between the outcomes depending on the health measures in place, the monetary and fiscal responses of governments, and also the effectiveness of various adjustments that businesses will make to their operations to operate more consistently with the health data, which lag merchandise trade data, well, a very 27.3%, and the 30%, and this was travel and tourism. So commercial the rates have increased substantially. So this is for 20, WTO forecasts say trade is expected to rise by weak recovery rather than a quick return to trend. So overall, we have a better outlook for 2020, but still it's very uncertain. And so the outcome, the recovery for all fronts, as the IMF chief said some days ago, the recovery will be uncertain, of course, and will be uneven among countries and sectors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A lot of uncertainty for the future, depending on a lot of factors, and an opportunity for countries, markets to compete on getting the more positive impact of this rather than the worst of it. So we've yet to see. Moving on to the next question, which I have for Mr. Leveillon. The Commission is reviewing its trade policy to assess how it can contribute firstly, to a swift and sustainable recovery, autonomy, in strengthening the EU. How do you envisage achieving open strategic autonomy while at the same time respecting multilateral trade rules? Also, are there trade imbalances between the EU and the United States and between EU and China that could hinder that autonomy? Mr. Levillon? Could you possibly unmute your, because we couldn't hear the first part of it?
Yes, it's better if I put it on.
Yes, now we can hear you.
I think it is important to clarify that open strategic autonomy in no way means autarky or reshoring. I think it is even proven that in order to have a resilient system, an open EU will be more resilient than a closed EU in the sense of not interacting with the rest of the world. It is just recently. So the logic of the open strategic autonomy is not, as you might perceive it, contrary to the WTO rules. It is certainly the opposite way that we see it. It is much more that we need to make sure that there is the full access for our company to third countries' market. Also full access for not just the market, but also the input that we need in order to operate. And on the opposite, what we need to make sure is that we are using all our leverage precisely to maintain open those access. Now, regarding the resilience dimension, I think it is also related to this point that you were indicating. It is true that we need also to make sure that the level playing field is present and is respected, and there is a fair competition in this open market. And it is where, indeed, we need to be ready to react unilaterally in case of unfair competition. And we have been mentioning before several instruments that are being prepared in order to be in a position to exercise leverage or to also restore the situation by protecting the EU market. And this is certainly something that will be done with even more resolution than what was done in the past. And also that will be also fighting the barrier with more forcefully than what was done in the past, precisely by the nomination of the recent CTO in the EU, and using all the tools that are available in order to ensure that it is respected. I don't know if I covered all the aspects of your questions, but I'm happy to complement if needed. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Comments between the questions that you all received, this would be a good time to let me know. I'm happy to give you the floor before we move on to questions from the audience. We are nearing the end of our program today, but I think there's interested parties out there, so we're going to continue. Any comments on any of the questions you heard from each other before I proceed into the clarifications and questions from the audience? Okay, I think we're doing good. We've answered the questions. From the audience, the first is actually a clarification rather than a question. The Cyprus asks, the 366 restrictive measures are during which period? This was mentioned, I think, either by Ms. Bournou in the beginning or Ms. Diakadoni. I don't remember who had mentioned. Ms. Diakadoni, yeah. So please comment.
Yes, 363 trade restrictive and trade facilitating measures cover the period from mid-October 2019 to mid-May 2020. So it's the latest monitoring report.
Okay, thank you for that. Now I'm going to move on to a question by Ron Hagenboom, senior economist. And the question is as follows, and this could be addressed to all three of you. How could we, policymakers, convince politicians to let markets, i.e. companies, make their own investment decisions about whether or not to reshore their activities and not to intervene in markets with policy shift towards actively promoting reshoring with subsidies? So who would like to take that question? And I'll go to all of you, whoever. Mr. Leveillon?
Yes,
Okay.
I don't, am I muted? No.
No, I can hear you. I think
Okay.
everybody can hear you.
No, it is, well, it is certainly something on which we are countries that indeed are, it is not something that is specific to the EU. When we refer to those questions, it is not just the EU that is considering this situation. The US are doing the same, Japan is doing the same, several other countries also are considering how to minimize their resilience from other third countries. So it is something that we see worldwide. So I think there is two levels to this question. It is obviously first, in order to make sure that indeed the policies are in line with the commitment that are taken that have been taken in WTO, and it is something that we are monitoring closely and that will be very vigilant. For the time being, what we notice is that there is much more now a situation of we feel that there is some legislative discussion taking place in third countries, but we've not seen yet. This will be coming. We have following this very closely. But there is not yet an active or massive change in this, but we see a change of narrative, and it is what is for us particularly of concern. Now, regarding the second element and the subsidies, it is true that the subsidies, as always, is something particularly problematic, but for this, normally we are well equipped in order to attack when these subsidies is harming the EU market. Something different is regarding the potential creation of overcapacity. But in this sense, we should keep in mind that the situation of shortages that have been experimented in some essential goods were due at the end for limitation of an undercapacity worldwide. We had an explosion of demand in some products that were not used in the past. And now there is a need, and I think we all agree that there is a need, that indeed there is an increase, a ramping up of those capacity. The question is how this will be done and what will be the situation for the long term. I think that currently the government are much more in the logic of fighting the current COVID and to be able to fight the COVID tomorrow. And it is still quite limited to a very narrow sector. So globally, it is of concern, this change of narrative. It is a concern, this change of colleagues also have been mentioning, and that is really also at the center of the rules in the WTO, is that all those aspects must be targeted, limited in time, and also necessary. If those three principles are there, I think the spillover negative effect might be limited, even if we still taking place. There is is on the long run, is not something for the whole economy. So we still believe that the best way is to have a competitive economy, and a competitive economy then should be open, because precisely if it is competitive, there is a mutual benefit. But all the challenges will be also from an industrial point of view to make sure that the EU economy is able to come back to its level of competitiveness and to be fully operational once COVID will be an old story.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's hope we move quickly back into a more to a competitive economy and get move through the challenges that we're now steering through in the better way possible. In the interest of time, I'd like to go with one final question, which has come from Mr. Dimitrios Maos, the Embassy of Greece in Sofia. Makes it quite a long introduction, but I will skip right through to his question. And this is concerning WTO. And the question is, how is WTO planning to address the challenge of keeping supply chains open and remove trade restrictions on medical supplies in view of the second wave of the pandemic during the next few months? I think you know who this is addressed to.
I guess it's addressed to me. So how the WTO can keep the supply chains open WTO is 164 governments, so I cannot speak on behalf of them. There are some rules to respect, but we're confident because this is a challenge we're facing right now. And even on the first wave of the pandemic, we had and nobody any problem in buying stuff in the supermarket, whatever it was, manufactured good. So I'm very confident personally. WTO as WTO, you know how it's, you have the rules, you have the dispute settlement. For rules, the WTO cannot do something more than this, than for to the pandemic. That will be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I know I said this was the final question, but it seems that our audience is engaged. So I'm going to ask the real final question here, which comes from a freelancer, Mr. Beluktis, and it's about the restrictive measures, if they're still all in effect. You have a position on that.
Can you please repeat? Because the question, I didn't hear the last bit.
Yes, it's for the restrictive measures. The question is, are they all still in effect?
Okay. Our estimates in, yes, for it was, I think, 28%. Okay, we talk about the restrictive measures from 2009 or the latest period. In the latest period, we estimated 28% of COVID-specific restrictive measures to have been repealed. So that's around the estimate we done.
Okay, thank you very much. I think at this point we come to the conclusion of our program today. I would like to thank the positioning on all the questions, and as well as to thank our entire panelist group and Mr. Filiopoulos, Mr. Dimitriadis, Ms. Asimakopoulou in the front end of our program, and to wish you all a good continuation into a challenging future. And soon we'll meet again to see where we are with future, let's say, COVID challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.